Hey guys, what's going on? We continue in our devotional series today in the book of Romans. We know from chapter 1 thus far, Paul has called out the entire world. All humanity is completely unrighteous. But he also assumes that there's a religious crowd who considers themselves self-righteous, and he knows that this religious crowd, particularly that of the Jewish people, would have a rebuttal or hypothetical supposed response to give to him as he's calling out people on their sin. And what he's been doing is he's been saying, look, your self-righteousness is not enough. Just because you belong to the covenant community of the people of Israel, just because maybe you have in your possession the law of God, just because your nation holds the promises of God and so on and so forth, and you've got a great national history, that doesn't mean that you yourself are not guilty as an individual before God. So he's been making this argument of even religious people themselves are guilty before God. So pick it up in verse 25. He says this, "For indeed, circumcision is of value if you practice the law. But if you are a transgressor of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision." And he's talking about the physical alteration of the foreskin of a male here in this sense in verse 25. He's saying just because you have received a physical alteration doesn't necessarily mean that you are following the law internally, and of which, if that's the case, you're going to be counted as uncircumcised at the heart level. That's the assumption. We know from Jeremiah chapter 9, I think it's Jeremiah 9 verses 25 and 26, that Jeremiah talks about how all Israel is uncircumcised in heart, which is really interesting because, the whole nation, especially, if you just consider the direct audience of the men, the whole nation of all of the males should have been circumcised. And Jeremiah was busy saying, no, you're not circumcised. You're actually guilty before God. Your heart is hardened. Then he goes into verse 26 and he says, so, and this is the hypothetical situation, so if the uncircumcised man, that being a Gentile who's not a part of the covenant community of Israel, they don't have a physical alteration to their body as a sign to the covenant that they belong. So if the uncircumcised man, hypothetically, keeps the requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision on the outside be regarded as circumcision? And when it says be regarded, that's in the futuristic tense. So this is called a divine passive. The hypothetical that Paul is giving us is that on Judgment Day, if someone who's not a part of the nation of Israel and that individual yet lives out the law of God, will they not be regarded as someone who has a circumcised heart at the end of the day? I don't think this is possible due to what Paul is about to say in chapter 3. He's just working with a hypothetical argument, but he's just simply stating the fact. What about the person who follows the law and doesn't have any religious merit to brag about? That person has a softer heart than you who have a calloused heart just because of your religiosity. A lot to say there. But then in verse 27, and he who is physically uncircumcised, again, that being the Gentile, if he keeps the law, will he not judge you who, though having the letter of the law and circumcision, are a transgressor of the law? So again, hypothetically, in the future, on Judgment Day, if this individual had kept the law, would they not be able to then have right to judge the person who had the law but didn't live it out? In other words, one would shame the other. You got to remember that Paul is giving a hypothetical argument. His whole point is that Jew or Gentile, everybody is sinful. And he's leading us to that point, and he'll get there further in chapter 3. Pick it up in verse 28 and 29. For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But here's his point. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart. But how does it become of the heart? He says, by the Spirit, not by the letter, not by looking at a set of laws chiseled into stone or written on a piece of paper. But circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. And his praise is not from men, but from God. In other words, this individual seeks approval and seeks obedience unto God alone at the heart level. He's not worried about who else is watching. He's not worried about what everybody else cares about. All he cares about is having this inward relationship with God, which is right with him. He knows when God is speaking to him. He knows when God is convicting him. He knows when God is teaching him to go a certain direction, and he has the discernment and the personal relationship with God because of his softened heart, his changed heart. The Bible here is pointing us to this fact. Your religious efforts mean nothing before God if your heart's not changed. Here's the thing about becoming a Christian at the end of the day, and this is where Paul is starting to lead us, is becoming a Christian is not taking pride in your religious efforts. Taking pride in your religious efforts will do nothing for you. Instead, a real Christian is someone who has been circumcised in the heart by the Holy Spirit. When the Holy Spirit has done something like a miracle to your own heart, you can then hear God, follow God, love God, unlike you could before. Maybe you didn't love God before. Maybe it appeared that you loved God on the outside, but you don't love God internally with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength, with your thoughts, with your passion, with your love for Him. You don't have it. And that's not possible unless, of course, the Holy Spirit comes and does a transformative work on your heart. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this devotional. Paul has more for us next week as we get into chapter 3. Please like it, share it, put it on social media. Again, this is an avenue and a vehicle to get the word out in our community about Jesus and His gospel. More can be found about us at OttawaBibleChurch.com. We have more content. We have a podcast, all other things like that. But wanted you to tune in, say thank you so much for listening in today. God bless you. Take care.